A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You have seen the movie scene 1,000 times. The high-ranking intelligence official leans over a workstation, points at a grainy screen, and tells a technician to enhance. Suddenly, the camera zooms in from space, follows a car weaving through traffic in real time, and we see the license plate from 300 miles up. It is cinematic, it is tense, and it is almost entirely a lie.
It is the great Hollywood orbital myth. I am Herman Poppleberry, and today we are stripping away the cinematic gloss to look at how space surveillance actually works in the real world. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the mechanics and the economics of commercial satellite tasking. He wants us to dig into how you actually trigger an overpass, what you are paying for, and whether this idea of continuous real-time coverage is anything more than an illusion created by clever software.
This is a perfect example of a technology that everyone knows exists, but very few people understand the friction involved in using it. When we talk about tasking a satellite, most people imagine a joystick in a room somewhere or an automated system that just follows a target. But the reality is dictated by the unforgiving laws of orbital mechanics. You are not just buying pixels, you are buying a specific moment in time and space where a massive piece of hardware is fighting its own momentum to look where you want it to look.
That is the crucial distinction. In the industry, we talk about archival data versus task data. Archival is easy. That is just going to a website like Maxar or Planet, finding a photo of a parking lot from last Tuesday, and paying for the license. Tasking is a completely different beast. When you task a satellite, you are buying future intent. You are essentially telling a multi-million-dollar asset that at 3:14 in the afternoon on Thursday, it needs to stop what it is doing and prioritize your specific coordinates.
So what does that actually look like for the satellite? Because I think the biggest misconception is that a satellite can just change its path. People think a satellite is like a drone that can just bank left or right to get a better view.
That is the first hurdle. For a satellite in low Earth orbit, or LEO, delta V is the most precious resource in the universe. Delta V is the change in velocity required to perform a maneuver. If a satellite actually changed its orbital plane to fly directly over a target, it would burn through its entire fuel supply in a matter of days. Instead, these satellites stay on their fixed tracks. They are moving at approximately 7.5 kilometers per second. That is over 17,000 miles per hour. When you task a satellite, you aren't asking it to move its body through space. You are asking it to pivot its sensors.
It is more like a passenger on a high-speed train looking out the window. The train is staying on the tracks, but the passenger can turn their head or use a mirror to see something off to the side.
That is a rare analogy that actually holds up. We call this off-nadir imaging. Nadir is the point directly beneath the satellite. Most of the time, the highest quality images come from looking straight down. But to increase the frequency of when they can see a target, companies use agile steering. They use reaction wheels, which are essentially high-speed flywheels inside the satellite, to rotate the entire chassis, or use steering mirrors to deflect the line of sight. This allows a satellite that is hundreds of kilometers to the east or west of a target to still capture an image of it.
But there is a technical cost to that, isn't there? When you look at something from a steep angle, you get atmospheric distortion and geometric stretching. If I am trying to measure the height of a building in Isfahan, an off-nadir shot might make it look like it is leaning or obscure the ground next to it.
You are dealing with the graze angle. The further you look away from the center of your track, the more atmosphere the light has to travel through. This introduces blur and reduces the effective resolution. If a satellite has a 30-centimeter native resolution at nadir, that might drop to 50 or 60 centimeters when it is looking 40 degrees off to the side. A savvy consumer who is paying for a task has to decide if they want a low-quality image today or a high-quality image 3 days from now, when the satellite is directly overhead.
And that brings us to the economics. Daniel asked about how consumers actually pay for this and what they are getting. I have looked at some of these commercial contracts and it feels a lot like high-stakes gambling. You aren't just paying for the photo, you are paying for the priority level in the queue.
It is a bidding war for pixels. Most providers have a tiered system, something like gold, silver, and bronze. If you are on a bronze tier, you are essentially saying, I want a photo of this uranium enrichment facility sometime in the next 2 weeks when the weather is clear and no one else is using the satellite. If you are on the gold tier, you are paying a massive premium to be at the top of the tasking list. If a conflict breaks out, or there is a sudden natural disaster, the provider will bump the bronze and silver users to make sure the gold tier customer gets their shot.
It reminds me of Uber surge pricing, but for the military-industrial complex. If there is a high-interest event like a missile test or a protest, the demand for those specific orbital slots goes through the roof. Does the price actually fluctuate in real time, or is it mostly based on these long-term contracts?
For the big players like the National Reconnaissance Office or major defense contractors, it is all about pre-negotiated capacity. But for the newer, more commercialized startups, we are seeing more of a spot market emerge. You can go onto a dashboard, see when the next available pass is, and see the price. But you are also paying for the risk of clouds. This is the part that drives people crazy. In most commercial tasking agreements, if the satellite takes a photo and it is 80% cloud cover, you still might have to pay a significant portion of that tasking fee. You are paying for the effort of the satellite, not necessarily the clarity of the result.
That seems like a massive bottleneck for intelligence. If I am trying to track a moving target, like a mobile missile launcher, and I have to wait for a clear day and a specific orbital slot, the target is long gone by the time the data reaches my desk.
This is where the continuous surveillance fallacy comes in. Daniel asked if satellites can loiter. The answer for a low Earth orbit satellite is a hard no. Physics simply won't allow it. To loiter over a single spot on Earth, you would need to be in geostationary orbit, which is about 35,000 kilometers up. At that distance, even with a massive telescope, your resolution is measured in meters, not centimeters. You can see a forest fire or a massive storm system, but you aren't seeing a car or even a large truck with any detail.
So how do they get those videos we see on the news? The ones where it looks like a continuous feed of a port or an airfield?
It is a synthetic construct. It is all about constellation density and post-processing. Instead of one giant satellite, companies like Planet or Black Sky use dozens or even hundreds of smaller satellites. They are all following each other in the same orbital plane or in a coordinated mesh. As one satellite passes over a target and moves out of range, the next one in the sequence is just arriving.
So it is like a relay race. Each runner only sees the target for maybe 30 to 60 seconds, but because there are so many runners, you can stitch the frames together to create the illusion of a longer duration video.
That is exactly the mechanism. But even then, it is not truly continuous. Even with 100 satellites, you might only have a revisit rate of once every hour or once every 30 minutes. For a site like the Natanz facility in Iran, which is a high-priority target, a commercial constellation might be able to get 5 or 6 good passes a day. Compare that to a military intelligence setup where they might have more classified assets and better coordination, but even they are bound by the same orbital gaps. There are periods of time, sometimes hours long, where no one has eyes on a specific coordinate from space.
I think people would be shocked to realize how much of our global security relies on these gaps. If you know the TLE, or the two-line element sets, which are the publicly available data points that describe a satellite's orbit, you can calculate exactly when a satellite will be overhead. We talked about this in episode 567 regarding satellite deception. If you are a state actor, you just wait for the gap. You move your sensitive equipment into the tunnel or under the camouflage net. The moment the satellite disappears over the horizon, and you have 20 minutes of total privacy before the next one arrives.
It is the orbital shell game. And what is interesting is that as the cost of launching satellites drops, the gaps are getting smaller, but they aren't disappearing. Even if you have 1,000 satellites, you still have to deal with the geometry of the sensor. If the satellite is too far to the east, it might be looking at the side of a mountain instead of the valley where the target is.
Let's talk about the difference between what a savvy consumer can get and what the NRO has. Because I think there is a belief that commercial imagery is now just as good as military-grade intelligence. We see these 30-centimeter resolution images from Maxar, and they look incredible. Is there still a significant gap?
There is, but it is narrowing in terms of resolution and widening in terms of multispectral capability. The NRO assets, the ones often referred to as keyhole satellites, are essentially Hubble Space Telescopes pointed at Earth. Their mirrors are much larger than anything on a commercial satellite. While commercial resolution is legally capped in the United States at around 15 to 20 centimeters, the military stuff is rumored to be sub 10 centimeter. At that level, you aren't just seeing a car, you are seeing the shape of the side mirrors and the texture of the roof.
But the bigger advantage for the military isn't just the sharpness, it is the integration. They aren't just looking at a picture, they are combining that tasking with signals intelligence. They know when a radar turns on or when a radio transmission happens, and they can automatically trigger a satellite task to go look at that specific spot. Commercial tasking is still very much a manual, or at least a semi-automated process of placing an order.
And the latency is the killer. In a military context, that image might be downlinked to a ground station, processed, and on a commander's tablet in minutes. For a commercial consumer, even with a high priority task, you might be looking at a several-hour delay between the satellite taking the photo and the data being available for download. You have to wait for the satellite to pass over a downlink station, or use an inter-satellite link like the one SpaceX is developing for Starlink to get that data back to Earth.
This brings up a point we touched on in episode 1091 about the BDA gap. BDA is Battle Damage Assessment. In the recent conflicts we have seen, the first images of a strike don't usually come from a multi-million-dollar satellite. They come from a guy with a smartphone and a Telegram account. The smartphone has zero latency. It is already on the ground.
That is a fundamental shift in how we think about surveillance. Satellite tasking is becoming a tool for verification and pattern-of-life analysis rather than initial detection. If I see a video on social media of an explosion at a factory, I then task the satellite to look at that factory over the next 3 days to see how they are repairing it, what kind of trucks are coming in, and how the security perimeter has changed. That is the pattern-of-life stuff that commercial tasking is actually great at.
So if I am a consumer and I want to track something like the progress of a new bridge or the movement of a shipping fleet, what am I actually looking for in a provider? Is it just the resolution, or is it that revisit rate?
It depends on your objective. If you are an environmental group tracking illegal logging in the Amazon, you don't need 30-centimeter resolution. You need a wide swath width, which is the amount of ground the satellite covers in a single pass. You want to see 100 kilometers at a time, so you can spot changes in the canopy. But if you are a hedge fund trying to count cars in a Walmart parking lot to predict quarterly earnings, you need high resolution, and you need it at a specific time of day, usually right before peak shopping hours.
And you have to account for the shadows. If you task a satellite for late afternoon, the shadows from the buildings might cover the very things you are trying to count. A savvy consumer looks at the sun's synchronous orbit. Most imaging satellites are in these orbits, so they pass over a target at the same local solar time every day. This keeps the lighting conditions consistent, which is vital for AI algorithms that are trying to detect changes. If the shadows are different every time, the AI gets confused and starts flagging false positives.
That is where the stitching and the AI post-processing Daniel mentioned come into play. We are moving away from looking at individual photos and moving toward looking at a living map. Companies are taking these disparate passes, which might be taken at different angles and under different lighting, and using computer vision to normalize them. They stretch the pixels, adjust the colors, and align the coordinates so perfectly that you can flip through them like a flipbook.
It creates the illusion of a stationary camera, even though the source data is a chaotic mess of different sensors moving at 18,000 miles per hour. But there is a danger in that synthesis, isn't there? When you start manipulating the data to make it look pretty for the consumer, do you risk losing the raw technical details that an analyst might need?
You absolutely do. This is a huge debate in the remote sensing community. When you apply sharpening filters or atmospheric correction, you are essentially making an educated guess about what the ground looks like. For a casual user, it is great. But for a scientist trying to measure the exact spectral signature of a chemical spill, their processing can be catastrophic. They want the raw, ugly data.
It is the difference between a filtered Instagram photo and a raw medical X-ray. One is for consumption, the other is for diagnosis.
And Daniel's question about Isfahan or Natanz is a great case study for this. These are some of the most photographed places on Earth. There are probably dozens of commercial and government satellites looking at those coordinates every single day. If you are a private analyst trying to monitor the Iranian nuclear program, you are essentially subscribing to a feed of these stitched-together images. You aren't just looking for a new building, you're looking for things like the pile of dirt from a new tunnel excavation. You have to measure the volume of that dirt over time to estimate how deep the tunnel is.
And that requires incredibly precise tasking. You can't just have a random photo. You need a consistent angle, so you can use trigonometry to calculate the height of the dirt pile based on the length of its shadow. If the satellite tasking isn't consistent, your math is going to be wrong.
And this is where the economics get even more interesting. If I am the Iranian government, and I know that a specific commercial provider is being tasked heavily to look at my facility, I can actually buy up the capacity myself. This is called defensive tasking. It is a bit of a legal grey area, but if I buy all the available slots for a specific window, the provider might not have any room left for the OSINT analysts or the journalists.
That is a fascinating strategy. It is basically a denial of service attack on orbital transparency. I wonder how the providers handle that. Do they have clauses that prevent a single actor from monopolizing a target?
Most of them have fair use policies, and they certainly wouldn't let a sanctioned entity like the Iranian government buy tasking directly, but they could do it through shell companies or third-party data brokers. The transparency of the space industry is a bit of a double-edged sword. It democratizes information, but it also gives state actors a very clear map of what the world can see.
It also creates a massive amount of noise. We are currently in an era where we have more data than we have human eyes to look at it. Daniel mentioned the BDA gap and the role of AI. I think the real future of tasking isn't a human sitting at a desk. It is an AI that detects an anomaly in a low-resolution, high-frequency feed and then automatically places a high-resolution tasking order to investigate.
That is the closed-loop system. You have a constellation of tiny, cheap CubeSats that act like scouts. They have a resolution of maybe 3 to 5 meters. They see a new convoy of trucks moving toward a border. The AI flags it and immediately sends a command to a high-resolution satellite, like a Maxar Worldview 4, to take a 30-centimeter look on the next pass. This reduces the cost because you're only paying for the expensive pixels when they actually matter.
But it still doesn't solve the weather problem. We keep coming back to this, but clouds are the ultimate encryption for the ground. You can have the best AI and the most expensive satellite, but if there is a thick layer of stratus over the target, you are blind.
Unless you use SAR, synthetic aperture radar. We haven't talked about that yet, but it is a huge part of the tasking market now. SAR satellites don't use visible light. They bounce microwave pulses off the ground and measure the return. They can see through clouds, they can see through smoke, and they can see in total darkness.
And the tasking for SAR is even more complex because you aren't just dealing with a camera angle, you are dealing with the phase and the polarization of the radar waves. If you want to see if a tank is made of metal or if it is a wooden decoy, you need a specific type of SAR tasking.
This is what we explored in episode 567. Decoys are incredibly effective against visible light satellites, but they are much harder to pull off against SAR if the analyst knows what they are looking for. The economics of SAR are currently much higher than visible light because the satellites are more expensive to build and the data is much harder to process. But for a consumer who needs a guarantee of coverage, regardless of the weather in Isfahan, SAR is the only way to go.
Let's get into the weeds of the actual tasking request. If I am a hedge fund manager and I want to task a satellite, I don't just send an email. There is a whole technical interface. You have to define your area of interest, or AOI. You draw a polygon on a map. Then you specify your parameters. Do you want panchromatic, which is black and white but very sharp, or multispectral, which gives you color and infrared, but usually at a lower resolution.
And you have to set your time window. This is where the economics of priority really kick in. If you give the provider a 30-day window, the price is relatively low. You are basically telling them to fit you in whenever the satellite has a spare moment and the weather is good. But if you need that image in the next 48 hours, you are moving into the emergency tasking tier. That can cost 5 to 10 times as much as a standard task.
And even then, it is not a guarantee. People think money solves everything in space, but if the satellite's reaction wheels are saturated, it literally cannot turn to look at your target. Reaction wheels work by spinning up to rotate the satellite, but eventually they reach their maximum speed. They have to use magnetorquers, which interact with the Earth's magnetic field, to bleed off that angular momentum. If your target overpass happens while the satellite is desaturating its wheels, you are out of luck.
That is a level of technical friction that Hollywood never shows. They never show the technician saying, "Sorry sir, we can't see the terrorist camp because our reaction wheels are at maximum RPM." But that is the reality of operating a billion-dollar piece of machinery in a vacuum. You are also fighting the power budget. Imaging, especially high-resolution imaging, takes a lot of electricity. The satellite has to point its solar panels at the sun to charge, then pivot its body to point the camera at the Earth. If it has been in the Earth's shadow for too long, it might not have the juice to perform a high-energy slew and a long-duration capture.
This brings us back to Daniel's question about revisit rates. If you are looking at a place like Natanz, which is tucked away in a mountainous region, your window of opportunity is even smaller. You have to account for the terrain. If the satellite is coming in from a low angle, the mountains might literally block the view of the facility. So you aren't just paying for the satellite to be overhead, you are paying for it to be in a specific geometric sweet spot.
And the revisit rate for a single satellite is usually measured in days. For a constellation like Planet Stubbs, which has over 100 satellites, they claim they can image the entire landmass of the Earth every day. But that is at a 3-meter resolution. If you want that 30-centimeter detail, you are looking at a much smaller fleet. Maxar only has a handful of high-resolution satellites. So, your revisit rate for the really good stuff might be once every 2 or 3 days for a specific spot.
Unless you are the military. The NRO doesn't just have better cameras, they have better orbits. They can sometimes use highly elliptical orbits or Molniya orbits to get longer dwell times over the northern hemisphere. While they still can't loiter, they can spend a much larger percentage of their orbital period looking at a specific region compared to a standard circular LEO orbit.
But even the NRO is moving toward the commercial model of large constellations. They realize that having 3 massive, incredibly expensive satellites is a vulnerability. If one fails or is targeted by an anti-satellite weapon, you lose a third of your capability. If you have 1,000 smaller satellites, the system is resilient. This is the proliferated warfighter space architecture that the Space Development Agency is working on. It is basically taking the commercial constellation concept and weaponizing it for maximum persistence.
So for the savvy consumer, the takeaway is that you're buying a probability, not a certainty. You are paying for a seat at a table where the house always has the advantage of physics and weather. If you want to track a moving target, you better have a very large budget and a very good AI to predict where that target will be when the next satellite window opens.
And you have to understand the latency. Even if the satellite takes the perfect photo at noon, it might not pass over a ground station until 2 in the afternoon. Then the data has to be decrypted, processed, ortho-rectified, and uploaded to your dashboard. By the time you see the truck, it is already 100 miles away. This is why the inter-satellite links are so important. If the imaging satellite can beam its data to a relay satellite in a higher orbit, like a TDRS or a Starlink node, the latency drops from hours to seconds.
That is the real holy grail of tasking, real-time downlinking. Once we have that, the gap between the event and the intelligence starts to vanish. But we are still years away from that being a standard commercial offering for everyone.
We are also seeing the rise of edge processing. Some of the newer satellites have powerful enough computers on board to run AI models in space. Instead of sending down a massive high-resolution image of 1,000 square kilometers, the satellite just sends a small text alert that says, "I found the ship you were looking for at these coordinates." This saves bandwidth and drastically reduces the time it takes for the consumer to get the answer they actually need.
It turns a satellite from a camera into a sensor. You aren't asking for a picture, you are asking for an answer. That is a fundamental shift in the economics of the industry. You are paying for the insight, not the raw data.
Which brings us to the future of this whole ecosystem. Daniel asked about HAPS, or High Altitude Platform Stations. These are the solar-powered drones and balloons that live in the stratosphere. They are the ultimate solution to the loitering problem. Because they are in the atmosphere, they can just stay there. They can circle over a city for months.
But as we discussed, the legalities are a nightmare. You can't just fly a HAPS over Isfahan. The Iranian air defense would have a field day. So HAPS are great for domestic surveillance, border security, or disaster relief in your own country, but they will never replace satellites for international espionage. Space is the only place where you have a legal right to look at anyone, anytime.
It is the ultimate high ground, and as the cost of getting to that high ground drops, thanks to reusable rockets, the tasking market is going to explode. We are going to see a world where every major corporation, every large NGO, and maybe even wealthy individuals have their own dedicated tasking streams.
It leads to a world of total but intermittent transparency. We will be able to see everything, but we will have to wait for the right orbital window to see it. The challenge for the next generation of analysts won't be finding the data. It will be making sense of the billions of images being generated every day.
It is a shift from a scarcity of information to an overwhelming surplus. And in that surplus, the truth can still be hidden if you know how to play the gaps.
For our listeners, the next time you see a satellite image in the news, I want you to look at the fine print. Look for the sensor name, the timestamp, and the off-nadir angle. If it is a Maxar image taken at a 40-degree angle, remember that the building you are looking at is actually hundreds of meters away from where it appears to be on the screen. Understanding the geometry of the task is the first step to becoming a sophisticated consumer of global intelligence.
And don't believe the zoom. If the camera seems to dive from the moon down to a street corner in a single smooth motion, you are watching a movie, not a mission. Real space surveillance is a series of snapshots, stitched together by math and hope, captured by machines screaming through the void at 17,000 miles per hour.
It is a lot less elegant than Hollywood, but in many ways, the reality is much more impressive. The fact that we can coordinate these machines at all is a testament to how far we have come since the first keyhole satellites were dropping film canisters out of the sky to be caught by planes in midair.
We have moved from catching film in nets to bidding for pixels in real time. It is a wild transition.
I think we have given Daniel a lot to chew on. The economics are moving toward a spot market. The physics are staying exactly where Kepler left them, and the continuous surveillance we see on TV is still a few years and a few hundred satellites away from being a reality.
But the gap is closing. Every launch brings us a little closer to that persistent eye in the sky.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping our own orbit stable. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that allow us to process these deep dives.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It helps us stay visible in the crowded constellation of podcasts.
You can find our full archive at myweirdprompts.com. We have over 1,400 episodes waiting for you, covering everything from the history of spy planes to the future of lunar mining.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from slow